There is something about you that has always felt slightly dangerous, not criminal, not unstable, dangerous in a quieter way, like you are walking through life with a level of awareness that makes other people uncomfortable, and you have spent years trying to figure out whether that means you are broken or ahead. You learned early that you see too much. In conversations, you do not just hear words. You track micro-expressions, tonal shifts, contradictions. You feel the gap between what people say and what they mean. It makes small talk exhausting. It makes group dynamics predictable. It makes you hyper-aware of the invisible hierarchy in every room. And here's the part no one told you. That level of perception isolates. You sit at a table surrounded by laughter, yet internally you are analyzing patterns of insecurity, dominance, fear of rejection. You scroll through social media and instantly detect performance, status signaling, validation hunger. While others consume reality, you dissect it. That difference slowly separates you from the herd. Carl Jung warned about individuals like this, not because they are weak, because they are rare, and rare structures are fragile when misunderstood. You have probably asked yourself questions you never voice out loud. Why does everyone seem content with surface-level living? Why do I feel like I am operating on a different frequency? Why does belonging feel like self-betrayal? The dangerous truth is not that you are rare. It is that rarity comes with psychological cost. Heightened consciousness increases isolation. Depth reduces compatibility. Intuition challenges authority. You start to feel like a stranger inside your own generation. Too analytical for comfort culture. Too introspective for distraction culture. Too intense for casual environments. And over time, that friction creates a silent narrative. Maybe I am the problem. That is the first mistake. If this line of thinking feels uncomfortably precise, subscribe now. Not for motivation, for clarity. This channel is not for passive scrolling. It is for people willing to examine themselves without excuses. If that is you, stay. Because what we are about to examine is not flattering. It is not mystical. And it will challenge the identity you have quietly built around being different. There is a reason this personality type struggles more than it admits. And if you do not understand the internal mechanics, your depth will turn against you. You are not just uncommon. You are structurally exposed. What is happening inside you is not random. It is structural. When a mind develops heightened perception and independent analysis early in life, it does not integrate smoothly into collective systems. It becomes observant before it becomes secure. That sequence creates tension. You learn to read the room before you learn to relax in it. You studied authority before you trusted it. You detected manipulation before you experienced belonging. That does something to a personality. It builds strength, but it also builds distance. This is where ego defense begins. Not arrogance, not superiority, defense. When you repeatedly feel misunderstood, your psyche adapts. You withdraw strategically. You share less. You test people quietly before opening up. You become self-contained. On the surface, it looks like independence. Internally, it is protection, and protection over time turns into isolation. The rare personality type Jung described often experiences emotional fatigue without obvious trauma. You are not exhausted because life is dramatic. You are exhausted because you are constantly processing layers beneath reality. Every interaction has subtext. Every environment has energy. Every decision carries long-term implications in your mind. Most people operate on reaction. You operate on interpretation. That cognitive load accumulates. You may call it introversion. You may call it being selective. But if you are honest, part of it is strategic withdrawal. You step back because engagement requires too much filtration, too much calibration, too much suppression of what you really see. And this is where identity fragmentation begins. Outwardly, you function, you perform, you adapt to social norms when necessary. Inwardly, there's a second layer observing everything, evaluating, questioning, dissecting. The gap between your external behavior and internal reality grows wider each year. You start to feel invisible, not because people do not see you, but because they do not see the depth operating behind your composure. They respond to your surface efficiency. They do not detect the internal complexity. Over time, that invisibility creates a quiet resentment. Wasted potential becomes a recurring thought. You know you are capable of more, but more requires an environment that matches your depth. And those environments are rare, so stagnation becomes the real threat, not failure, not rejection. Stagnation. A mind built for depth, forced into shallow systems, will either numb itself or implode. Many in this category choose numbness. Endless content, endless analysis, endless preparation, always thinking, rarely executing, because execution exposes you. It forces your internal architecture into the external world, and that is risky. If this level of analysis is uncommon in your current environment, subscribe. Not as entertainment, as filtration. Most will not stay for conversations like this. The ones who do are building something different. Here is the partial revelation. Your intensity is not the primary danger. Your mismanagement of it is. And what happens next depends entirely on whether you continue operating as a quiet observer or decide to restructure the role you play. There is a phase that almost no one talks about. The phase where the version of you that once worked stops functioning. The humor that helped you blend in feels forced. The ambition that once drove you feels hollow. The social roles you performed start to feel like costumes that no longer fit your frame. This is not a breakdown. It is a collapse of the old structure. The rare personality type does not evolve gradually. It sheds. And shedding feels violent when you are inside it. You wake up one morning and realize the conversations you tolerated now irritate you. The environments you adapted to now drain you. The people who once felt aligned now feel distant. You start declining invitations. You speak less. You observe more. Others may interpret this as moodiness or arrogance. It is neither. It is restructuring. But restructuring is dangerous without awareness. When an old identity dissolves, there is a void between who you were and who you are becoming. In that void, doubt gets loud. You question your direction. You question your standards. You question whether you are self-sabotaging or finally self-respecting. Solitude increases, not because you hate people, but because superficial connection feels like regression. You would rather sit alone with your thoughts than dilute yourself for comfort. That decision builds strength. It also amplifies pressure. Because here is the risk no one warns you about. If you rebuild incorrectly, you solidify isolation instead of depth. You can convince yourself that detachment equals superiority, that emotional distance equals control, that needing no one equals power. Slowly, the adaptive solitude that was meant to refine you hardens into disconnection. The mind begins to overvalue independence and undervalue integration. You become efficient but unreachable, insightful but unrelatable, disciplined but emotionally armored. That is not individuation. That is defensive architecture disguised as growth. The rare personality type must leave the herd psychologically, but it cannot live permanently outside human connection. If you retreat too far, you become the man who understands the world but cannot participate in it. and understanding without participation turns into sterile intelligence. This is the pressure you feel now. You sense that something in you is changing. The old motivations no longer fuel you. The old distractions no longer satisfy you. But the new identity is not fully formed. That liminal state is uncomfortable. If you are watching this from a specific city, comment it. I want to see where this silent restructuring is happening, not for vanity metrics, for observation, because this process is happening quietly across environments that appear stable on the surface. Here is the unresolved tension. You cannot go back to who you were, but you are not yet who you need to become. And how you handle this transition determines whether your rarity becomes strength or permanent isolation. At some point, you will be tempted to blame the environment, the culture, the shallow conversations, the algorithms, the workplace, the dating market. It is easy to say the world is too unconscious for someone like you. It protects your ego. It keeps your identity intact. But that narrative is incomplete. Yes, most systems reward conformity. Yes, depth is rare. But if you remain stagnant, it is no longer society's fault. It is a failure of structure. The rare personality type does not collapse because it lacks intelligence. It collapses because it lacks discipline. You feel more. You see more. You think further ahead. That is not enough. Without cognitive control, your perception turns into rumination. Without behavioral consistency, your insight turns into fantasy. Without emotional containment, your empathy turns into exhaustion. You do not need more awareness. You need tighter regulation. Cognitive control means you decide which thoughts are useful and which are indulgent. Not every pattern you detect requires analysis. Not every future outcome requires rehearsal. A sharp mind without boundaries becomes self-destructive. Behavioral consistency means you execute even when you are uninspired. Depth does not exempt you from repetition. The rare personality often waits for alignment, for clarity, for the perfect internal state. That waiting becomes paralysis. Action must precede certainty. Emotional containment does not mean suppression. It means refusing to let your internal weather dictate your external structure. You can feel deeply without behaving impulsively. You can detect dysfunction without reacting to it. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Some of your exhaustion is self-created. You replay conversations that no longer matter. You simulate futures that may never happen. You absorb emotions that were never yours to carry. Then you call it sensitivity. No, it is undisciplined permeability. If you want your rarity to become leverage instead of liability, you must build routines that stabilize you. Sleep discipline, physical training, controlled information intake, intentional silence, structured work blocks. Not because it sounds productive, because your nervous system requires order. Without structure, collapse turns into decay. And decay is subtle. It looks like overthinking disguised as depth. It looks like isolation disguised as standards. It looks like procrastination disguised as preparation. You cannot afford that. Subscribe if you are willing to apply structure, not just consume insight. Most will listen. Few will implement. Intensity without discipline is chaos. And chaos, no matter how intelligent, eventually destroys itself. At the beginning, I told you there is something about you that feels dangerous, not unstable, not broken. Dangerous because of awareness. Dangerous because you see through surfaces. Dangerous because you cannot comfortably participate in illusions. The mistake was never your depth. The mistake was trying to survive without redesigning yourself around it. Strategic reconstruction begins with elimination. You eliminate passive consumption that overstimulates your perception. You eliminate relationships that require self-betrayal. You eliminate internal narratives that frame you as misunderstood genius or permanent outsider. Both are ego traps. Then you build. You build cognitive filters. Not every insight deserves your energy. Not every emotional signal requires response. You decide what enters your system and what is ignored. That is power. You build physical discipline. The body stabilizes the mind. Training is not aesthetic. It is neurological regulation. When your physiology is strong, your perception becomes sharper, not heavier. You build selective alliances, not many, few. People who respect silence. People who value competence. People who do not feel threatened by depth. You do not need approval. You need alignment. And you build output. This is where most rare personalities fail. They analyze. They refine internally. They prepare endlessly. But they hesitate to externalize their architecture. Write, build, lead, create systems, launch ideas. Your perception must produce something tangible. Otherwise, it corrodes you from the inside. There is something else you must endure. Misunderstanding will not disappear. You will still be called intense. You will still feel ahead of conversations. You will still outgrow environments. The difference is that now it will not destabilize you, because you will understand the structure of your mind. You are not here to blend in. You are here to integrate depth with execution. The rare personality type is not meant to float above society criticizing it. It is meant to enter it with clarity and reshape parts of it through disciplined action. That requires humility. It requires boundaries. It requires consistent output. Your danger becomes utility when it is controlled. Your isolation becomes focus when it is structured. Your intensity becomes leadership when it is directed. The question from Chapter 1 was whether you are broken or ahead. Now you understand. You are unstructured, and structure changes everything. If you are ready to go further, the next video will show you how to protect your energy from psychological drainers without becoming emotionally cold. It is not about cutting people off. It is about building internal armor without losing depth. Watch it next, not later. And subscribe if you are building this version of yourself deliberately.